Hello, beautiful people, and welcome, to the Kinich pre-release analysis. I am pretty excited for this one because Kinich honestly looks like a very fun character to play. So let's just get right into it. First, we have our base stats. Base HP, 12,858. Base defense, 802. As usual, it doesn't really matter what the base attack is because a character could have lower base attack and higher scaling, or higher base attack and lower scalings. The attack by itself doesn't mean anything, and I just look at the actual damage numbers at the end. But the base HP and the base defense are, because that's your defensive stats. It's not what your damage scales off of. And when it comes to defensive stats, he's pretty normal. He doesn't have outstanding HP, but he does have pretty high base defense. As we're gonna see, he is an on-fielder, so he's not particularly tanky, but he's not squishy for on-fielders. He is a Claymore character. Claymore characters often tend to be a little bit more tanky than others. And then his Ascension is crit damage. Now, the fact that this is crit damage is pretty important. So for those of you that have watched the most recent pre-release, which was the Milani one, we talked about how Milani's Ascension stat being crit rate paired with how easy it is for her to obtain crit rate because of her kit and her build can, in some situations, make it really difficult to get a reasonable crit ratio because you overcap on crit rate too easily. The fact that Kinich's Ascension stat is crit damage instead of crit rate makes this infinitely easier. When it comes to Milani, if you were running a crit rate weapon, you were basically already starting at 100 crit rate, whereas with Kinich, that's not the case. So it's a lot easier not to overcap on crit. It's still possible, so it's still something to keep in mind. Crit damage rolls will still tend to be slightly better than crit rate rolls, but a lot easier to avoid. So let's look at what he does. We're gonna skip the normal attacks. He does have a nice, cool, interesting mid-air attack thing, but that doesn't really matter in combat. Let's talk about his skill. So Kinich uses his big game hunting skills to either move swiftly or attack his opponent. When there is an opponent or object that can be attacked nearby, he will attach a grappling hook to the target and enter Night Soul Blessing with 0 Night Soul points. If neither is nearby, he fires a grappling hook forward and swings in midair, and this skill's cooldown is decreased by 60%. Can be held. When held, he can aim the grappling hook. So he can use this out of combat as a way to grapple himself forward, but that's not what we're going to be talking about for the pre-release, because obviously we're more interested in the combat. So in combat, he grapples to an enemy, and then he starts spinning around them. You can choose the direction you spin, and you can change the direction you're spinning whenever, but you will have to spin. We've covered how Night Soul mechanics work a little bit in the Milani pre-release, but I understand that not everyone is going to be watching both videos, so as a very quick recap, there's a few mechanics that are called Night Soul something when it comes to Natlan characters. You don't need to pay too much attention to the names. For now, all you have to keep in mind is that when he uses his skill, he enters a special state. And he starts with 0 points. He has a lot of ways to gain points while he's in that state. And once he has 20 points, he can do an enhanced attack. So the core gameplay loop during his uptime is you grapple onto something, you spin around the enemy while attacking it, and try to gather Night Soul points as quickly as possible. And once you have 20, you do your big cannon shot, which does a lot of damage. And then you repeat. So how does he gain points? Kinich's Night Soul Blessing lasts 10 seconds and generates 2 Night Soul points every second. In this state, Kinich will hook onto a nearby opponent and perform a variable attack. When using a normal attack, Kinich will fire loop shots as he loops around the grapple target based on his current movement direction, dealing Night Soul aligned dendro damage and generating 3 Night Soul points. Loop shot damage is considered elemental skill damage. This is a lot of words that effectively means while he's spinning, he can do pew-pew normal attacks, and when he does, he generates 3 points. When Night Soul points are at max, he can use Elemental Skill Scale Spiker Cannon. Consume all Night Soul points to deal Night Soul aligned dendro damage. When it's held, he can aim the shot. After firing the cannon, Kinich will try to grapple to its target. So again, a lot of words to say. Once your points are full, you can do a big pew or a big bam. So he does pew pew, pew pew, pew pew, bang, and then he repeats. While in Night Soul Blessing, after grappling an opponent or firing a Scale Spiker Cannon, a blind spot will be generated next to the opponent. And when you enter the zone, you generate points. In other words, while you're spinning around the enemy, you have a minigame that's where your objective is to enter the triangle. That gets highlighted, and when you do, you gain points. So going to the sector that gets highlighted gets you to fire off your big bang a little bit faster. And now we're going to quickly read his Ascension 1 passive, because it's also related to Night Soul points. When in Night Soul's Blessing, opponents hit by Kinich's elemental skill will enter the Desolation state, and when affected by Burning or Burgeon, they will restore 7 Night Soul points to him. Night Soul points can be gained this way once every 0.8 seconds. The Desolation state will persist until this instance of Kinich's Night Soul Blessing state ends. In other words, if the enemy you're currently attacking gets hit by either Burning or Burgeon damage, he generates 7 points up to once every 0.8 seconds. So, to recap, you have 4 ways of gaining Night Soul points. First way, time passing, 2 per second. Second way, normal attacking, or rather, pew-pews, 3 per pew-pew. Third way, sector minigame, 4. And fourth and last way, burning/Burgeon, 7 per proc. In practice, the way this is going to look is in teams that trigger Burning or Burgeon very quickly, very reliably, you will do your sector minigame and generally be able to get a bang after 2, maybe 3 pew-pews, up to a total of about 4 big bangs. When you're playing teams that do not have Burning or Burgeon, it's going to be 2 to 3 instead of 3 to 4. The exact amount that you will get is going to depend on your team. For now, and for the rest of this pre-release, I want you to assume that unless otherwise specified, any Burgeon or Burning team is getting 4 bangs, and any non-Burning team is getting 3. If it's different from that, I'll try to mention it. At the end of the day, we're relying on leaker gameplay and footage for these assumptions. So take it with a grain of salt. Looking at the numbers on this, right? Every pew-pew is 200 motion value at level 9, and every bang is 1200. These numbers are actually pretty good. However, let's talk about his burst. His burst, 18-second cooldown, 70 energy cost, unleashes the power of Ajah, the almighty Dragon Lord, on a limited, conditional, restricted, contractual, partial, temporary basis, dealing Night Soul-aligned AoE Dendro damage. Ajah will unleash his Dragon Breath at intervals, dealing Night Soul-aligned AoE Dendro damage. So, as you may have noticed, this is AoE Dendro damage, this is not. While this is good damage, it is pretty restricted to single target. His performance in AoE is going to be pretty ass. Technically, even things that don't say AoE Dendro damage have a little bit of AoE, but the AoE is not very large. AoE on the ult is a bit better. However, the numbers on it are a lot lower. His ult gets a total of, from what I understand, 6 hits from the laser, plus the initial hit. Might be 7, I'm not entirely sure, but I believe it's 6, which is a total of 1200 motion value, plus the 200, so a little bit over that. But to put this into perspective, that's what one cannon hit does, and he can get up to 4 of these. Which means that, all things considered, his ult is a pretty small portion of his damage, and overall is just not particularly good. Finally, when a nearby party member triggers a Night Soul burst, Kinich will gain 1 stack of Hunter's experience up to 2 stacks. When he uses the cannon hit, all stacks will be consumed, and the damage will be increased by 320% of his attack for each stack. Most of the time, what this means is once per rotation, you get 320% more motion value. So, effectively what this means is that a very large majority of his damage comes from his skill, a bit of damage from the ult. However, the ult animation is relatively long, and what you're gonna see is that his ult is very much one of those ults that's kind of just there, where you can use it if you want, but it doesn't feel like you're missing out if you don't. I believe this is an ult that is definitely not worth building ER for in teams where you would need high ER to cast it every rotation. I think you feel completely fine skipping it. I think you're still better off using it than skipping it if you can, but it's really not that important. His ult also extends his Night Soul Blessing duration by 1.7 seconds, which is about the animation time of the ult, which means you can cast your ult in the middle of your skill, and it's not going to feel completely awful, which is a nice little quality of life thing that I wish more characters had, but that doesn't matter too much. So all in all, this is a character that pretty much does all of his damage from his skill, with a little bit coming from his ult. But yeah, his bang, his cannon, is a sphere with a radius of 3, which is not that bad in terms of AoE, but you can't aim it too well. You can hold, but if you hold, it means that you're losing time, and you're already relatively tight if you want to try to get 4, so I don't think holding is going to be realistic. And then his pew-pews are the same AoE as Hyperbloom, so pretty much none. What I've said about the ult, I do want to add during this time, he can, like during the burst animation, he can still gain Night Soul points from either his passive or the skill itself, which means that it helps make it easier to get 4. Again, before I test him, it's hard to tell how tight the timing is going to be for everything, but it should help at the very least. Next up, we can go over his Constellations. After Kinich lands from his midair swing, which happens in exploration when you use your skill, his movement speed will be increased by 30%, which is completely worthless in combat. Additionally, scale spiker cannon, so your bang, crit damage is increased by 100%, which is a decent amount of stats. It's not on all of his damage, but it's on a pretty big chunk of it. C2, when Kinich's elemental skill hits an opponent, it will decrease their Dendro-Res by 30% for 6 seconds. Additionally, the first bang cannon that Kinich fires after entering Night Soul Blessing has increased AoE, and its damage is increased by 100%. Also, pretty good constellation. Just the resistance effect is already pretty good, but then on top of that, you get better AoE and more front-loaded, which is also quite nice. C3 is skill damage, which is good. C4, when in Night Soul's Blessing, Kinich will restore 5 energy after using his loop shots or after unleashing the skill spiker cannon. Energy can be regenerated this way once every 2.8 seconds. Additionally, his ult deals 70% more damage. Also, kind of nice. I will say though, this one's not that big of a deal because you already get a good amount of front-loaded damage and a lot more damage into your skill from the first 3 constellations, which makes it so that the ult itself becomes a lot less relevant, but it's still good. C5 is ult talent levels, which are okay, but not great. And then C6, after Scale Spiker Cannon hits an opponent, it will bounce between opponents once, dealing 700% of his attack as Dendro damage. Yeah, okay, so this makes it so that his skill bounces, and if it has an enhanced effect from either his Ascension 4 or his C2, that effect is also applied to the bounces. Overall, these are, I think, pretty average constellations when it comes to recent constellations, which means better than average if you look at all of the constellations that have ever been released. But I think that compared to other recent characters, they're very much in line with what you'd expect. So now, let's get into the real meat and potatoes of it all. There's not actually that many weapons to talk about. So let's actually start by talking about Earthshaker. Earthshaker is high base attack percent substat, and gives skill damage percent when you trigger a pyro-related reaction, like burning or Burgeon, which in Kinich's teams happens very, very easily. And so effectively at R5, it's also 32 damage percent on his main source of damage. As it turns out, that's a pretty damn good effect with a pretty good stat line, which kind of makes it so that almost every other 4-star weapon is just not really worth thinking about. If you don't have it at high refine, which is obviously very possible because new craftable weapon, you might not have the prototypes for it yet, other weapons start becoming viable alternatives, like Blacklift Slasher, the Melusine sword, which is fine, but his lack of real reliance on his burst means that all the weapons that give ER are not that good. And the fact that there is an event that guarantees you a free Earthshaker R1 without having to use a prototype for it, which, by the way, remember to go do the event. I'm not sure if you can get the rewards from it without doing the event, but it's the web event. Off we go to the Nation of Pyro. If you're planning on using Earthshaker on Kinich, don't forget to do that. That'll save you a prototype. But yeah, Earthshaker is best free-to-play option, and outside of low refined Earthshaker, the other 4-star weapons aren't really worth a consideration, with the exception of Serpent Spine. However, there are things to say about Serpent Spine that could potentially make it worse on him than on other characters. Keep in mind that you can lose your Serpent Spine stacks from self-damage from burning. It generally won't happen too much in AoE because you're inherently spinning around the enemy, in single target. But if you're in AoE, you're pretty likely to enter a hitbox of enemies that are around. I think generally it's going to be relatively easy to avoid, but it is still something that's worth keeping in mind. With Serpent Spine, you will get a little bit less stacks with Kinich than you would on other characters because of that burning. When you have stacks on it, Serpent Spine is his best free-to-play or his best 4-star option. At full stacks, R5, it's just his second best weapon overall after his signature. But obviously, the amount of stacks that you have and your refine are going to matter a lot. If you're not willing to wait for your stacks before you start, or if you lose stacks because of burning, Serpent Spine's performance is going to dip. I'd say that the average performance of a high refined Serpent Spine is good enough to justify playing it over Earthshaker, but a low refined Serpent Spine is probably pretty similar to an R5 Earthshaker. Next up, you have Wolves and Unforged, which are honestly pretty bad 5-star stat sticks. It's not even that they're that bad, it's just that you're going to get get pretty saturated on attack, and Earthshaker has a very good passive, so its relatively lower base stat line isn't actually that big of a problem because the passive is better, and you're gonna see situations where Unforged, Wolves, and Earthshaker all perform around the same level, with each potentially being better depending on the situation. If you have a shield on your team, Unforged will be the best of the three. If you don't have a lot of external attack buffs and you can proc Wolf's passive, Wolves will be the best of the three. If you have a lot of external attack buffs, no shield, Earthshaker should generally be the best of the three. But for a 5-star stat stick, obviously they're not very good. If you already have them, not really worth leveling Earthshaker because the performance will be very similar. But if you see them on banner, they're not something to be excited about. Next up, we have Verdict and Redhorn, which are decent 5-star stat sticks. Both of them are pretty much always better than Earthshaker, but not by that big of a margin, so you're still not too happy to see them on a banner. Speaking of the Red Sea, or the Reed Sea, good 5-star stat stick. It is above Redhorn and Verdict, again, because just like Serpent Spine, you are relatively likely to encounter situations where you end up damaging yourself with burning, but with Beacon of the Red Sea, that's an upside, not a downside, which makes it a pretty good stat stick. Even without proccing that effect, it's still a fine stat stick that's around the same level as Verdict and Redhorn, but if you do proc the effect, then it's just straight up better. But again, it's not that big of an upgrade from Earthshaker, so it's not something you're even too happy to see. And then finally, Fang of the Mountain King. This is best in slot, it's a signature weapon. When it comes to the comparison to other signature weapons, I'd say it's about as much of an upgrade from free-to-play option to signature, but the other alternatives can influence that a lot. For example, when you look at the upgrade from Prototype Amber to Nevilette's signature for him, it's a pretty big upgrade, but the Battle Pass weapon is, in a lot of situations, not much worse than the signature, and so the signature's value isn't necessarily as high. In Kenich's case, there's not really another weapon that's too exciting between his free-to-play and his signature, but the increase from the free-to-play to the signature is not incredibly high. It's pretty average. But yeah, and yeah, his signature pretty much just gives you 60% damage on your skill and burst, and that's it. That's pretty, that's all there is to it. If I'm ordering them from best to worst, we're gonna have, obviously, Fang of the Mountain King first, then Beacon, then Verdict and Redhorn, then probably Serpent Spine, then Unforged and Wolves, and Earthshaker kind of all together. Next up, artifact sets, and this one is very easy. The artifact sets they are releasing in 5.0 are very powerful. They're conditional to pretty much only be usable on Natlan characters, but they're very powerful. So the set you're going to want is the Obsidian Codex. It gives you 15% damage percent and 40% crit rate. It's a lot of stats. That's what you want. That being said, you're not going to be able to have an amazing set of this on day one because, actually, unlike Milani, Kinich is getting released after this set, so it'll be a little bit easier, but you might still not have a good set by the time he comes out. So let's still quickly mention some of the other artifact sets. If you're playing him in burning teams, the burning set is going to be alright. Other than that, if you're playing him with Furina, you can obviously use Marechaussee. Unlike Milani, Kenich's damage is not normal or charge attack damage though, which means that Marechaussee, even with Furina, is still meaningfully worse than Obsidian Codex. Obviously, it's fine for day one, but it's definitely, it'll definitely be worth farming for Obsidian Codex, even if you are playing him with Furina. Outside of that, probably just go for some weird two-piece bullshit. Yeah, 4 Golden Troop is fine. It's effectively a two-piece set. They're 2-piece 20% skill damage, 2-piece 25% skill damage. Next up, artifact stats. And in Kenich's case, it's pretty much always going to be attack, damage, crit. His ult isn't good enough to justify building a lot of ER. ER is fine on him, it's not a useless stat, but even if you don't use your ult, his skill does so much damage that you're better off running an attack sense than an ER sense. And he'll be pretty saturated on attack, so you pretty much always want a damage goblet. He doesn't have too many sources of damage percent, and you pretty much always want a crit circlet as well. So attack, damage, crit, pretty much always. And finally, we get into the real interesting part, which is the teams. Kenich's teams are hard to properly define. I think I'll be separating it in Bennett, Emilie, Bennett, Furina, Bennett, Flex, Burgeon, Emilie, Flex, and Hyperbloom. Oh yeah, I guess I also Burning Load. Okay. First, let's just very quickly discuss Bennett himself. Bennett does force you into a circle. However, in practice, if you position yourself properly, getting your damage with Bennett's buff isn't actually too difficult from what I've seen. It is a limitation, so obviously, if you manage to have the same DPS as a Bennett team with a non-Bennett team, that's great. You're very happy with that, but there are not a lot of non-Bennett teams that keep up with the Bennett teams in terms of damage, so very often it's going to be worth working around Bennett's circle in order to get his buff. Keep in mind, Bennett's buff lingers for a couple seconds after you exit the circle, so even if you shoot while you're out of the circle, you can still, without too much of a problem, get your buff. So, as a general rule, his like very base default team is going to be Bennett, Emilie, Flex. That last flex slot, let's work from Xiangling so that we can really understand why it doesn't have to be her. So if you are to use Xiangling in that last slot, the only buff you get for Xiangling is Bennett, right? You get Bennett, you get Power Resonance, you get Noblesse, sure, but you don't have swirls, and Xiangling isn't vaping. Because of that, the actual damage that Xiangling is doing is it's fine, but it's not outstanding. It's not enough to carry the team by itself. When you actually look at the team's damage distribution, what you'll notice is that because Deepwood is important to have, at least on someone on your team, because obviously you're playing Kinich, so you would very much want to be able to actually have your Dendro Res Shred, putting Deepwood on Emilie versus putting the Burning Set on her, you actually lose more damage than if you were to put Deepwood on Xiangling. Okay, so let's think about with Xiangling. Well, if you have Xiangling on Deepwood and no external buffs outside of Bennett, her damage is even lower. On top of that, Xiangling is the only meaningful source of pyro damage in your team, which means that Xiangling's C6 and her C1, the one that gives Guoba Shred, don't really do anything for your team DPS. And what you're left with is an off-field damage dealer that isn't bad, but really doesn't stand out too much either. And you're playing a team with relatively poor defensive utility that is locked into 20+ second rotations because of a unit that arguably contributes the least to the team's damage. Between Kinich, Bennett, Emilie, and Xiangling, Xiangling is the one that contributes the least to the team DPS. Bennett is the one that has the least DPS, but his buff is a lot more meaningful than Xiangling's damage. If you were to replace Xiangling with someone else, it would be possible to shorten your rotations. So, because of that, being able to shorten your rotation by sacrificing Xiangling for another defensive option that can also carry Deepwood, you will lose Xiangling's personal damage, but in exchange, you can potentially have shorter rotations and potentially more uptime, more Bennett uptime on your carry, because Xiangling's animations are a little bit longer than the average defensive option. And all of this to say, the team is about as good offensively in terms of DPS, if not better, when instead of using Xiangling, you use someone like Daya. Daya is also locking you into 20-second rotations. However, Daya herself, outside of the Deepwood, doesn't really need any specific gear, which means you can put her on sack, and as long as you proc it, shorten your rotations to less than 20 seconds. Anyways, I'm not saying you can't play Xiangling. Xiangling is still very much one of the good options. But what I am saying is that because what Xiangling is doing for the team is not something that Kinich's teams can take advantage of that much, it makes it so that there are definitely other alternatives. Those other alternatives, mainly for like the team core of Bennett Emilie, are Daya, Toma, Albedo, Chiori, Kachina. And honestly, the difference in team DPS between all of those last options is pretty small. So you can kind of use whichever one. Next, you have the Bennett Furina core, which I'd say is a little bit more restrictive than the Bennett Emilie core. Furina's Hydro application is going to potentially screw with your burning uptime without necessarily giving you enough Burgeons to make up for that, which means that you're kind of better off as the last slot, pretty much always using a Pyro slot. Mainly Xiangling. Obviously, Furina being on the team instead of Emilie means that you're getting more damage percent, which means that Xiangling's personal damage becomes a lot more significant. You can also, instead of Xiangling, still go for a defensive option like Daya, like Toma. They're still completely alright, but I would not recommend defensive options that are not Pyro, or like last slots that are not Pyro. Next up, Bennett Flex. So if you're just doing Kinich Bennett actually works as a core in a very similar way to something like Hu Tao, Xing Tao, in the sense that you can put a 2-unit strong support core with them. So for example, Albedo Chiori, you can do Kachina Chiori. Obviously, if you just think about it a bit, you could realize, oh yeah, you can also just do Emilie or Furina as those slots, but we've already covered those. Outside of like pairs that use Furina or Emilie, there are not too many 2-unit pairs that are that strong by themselves. Next up, you have Burgeon. If you're doing Burgeon, you need a Burgeon trigger. So Daya, Toma, Shangling. You need a source of Hydro app, and then you need either another source of Pyro or a second source of Dendro. Generally, if you want to play Burgeon teams, I would recommend double Dendro with a Hydro that applies a lot of Hydro like Singto. I think that as a general rule, Burgeon teams are fine, but they are not the main teams you should be looking towards. Mainly, we just still don't have the best options when it comes to Pyro and Hydro options for Burgeon teams. I think Kinich is very likely to see some support when it comes to Burgeon in later character releases, but I wouldn't expect too much on release. And I also want to clarify, if you technically trigger Burgeon in a team that has Furina, that is not what I'm talking about when I'm talking about Burgeon. There's a reason why I had Bennett Furina as a category. Burgeon I'm mainly looking at teams that actually focus on triggering Burgeon like a decent amount. Next, just Emilie Flex. So we're entering teams without Bennett. Like Burgeon, Emilie Flex is a little rough. I think at least Burgeon has the upside of Burgeon itself being AoE damage, which can make it a little bit less bad in AoE, because obviously AoE is going to be Kenich's weakness. Emilie Flex teams don't really have that upside, and also don't tend to reach the same heights as the Emilie Bennett teams, with the exception of Burning Load teams, which is teams that use burning and overload. Effectively, you're attempting to get a Quicken aura, and you're using that as your fuel for burning instead of a Dendro aura, which can let you trigger spread and aggravate while the enemy is burning. The potential issue with that is that it can be hard to trigger your Quicken. You shouldn't expect too much Quicken uptime in these teams, but you'll still get a little bit of it. This is teams that are going to use something like Emilie Fischl or Nahida Fischl, although Nahida Fischl is a lot worse than Emilie Fischl. Fischl in general is not that great of a teammate for Kinich. There are some teams that are going to be fine, but mainly I'd say that Emilie Fischl and then Flex for your burning proc is going to be the best one of them, and the rest are going to be a little underwhelming. And then finally, we have the thing that is sure to make both you and me angry and sad and frustrated and mad and yeah, which is Hyperbloom. Hyperbloom is good with Kinich. Hyperbloom is already a good 3-unit core, and Kenich's pew during his spin do not count as normal attack damage, but they do count as normal attack animations, which is the requirement in order to trigger Singto and Yelan's coordinated attacks. On top of that, he applies Dendro, benefits from Deepwood being there, and deals pretty reasonable damage himself, even without too many external buffs, which just makes him a pretty good driver for Hyperbloom. He's not the best, he's not the worst, but Hyperbloom team is going to be one of his best teams, whether you do it with Singto or with Yelan. Now, I haven't really mentioned his interruption resistance yet. He does get pretty decent resistance to interruption during his spin, but it is not perfect. So getting additional sources of defensive utility is still useful, but it's not necessary. But yeah, you can also play him in a Quickbloom team. That also works. You can play him in Quicken teams, but I haven't included them because I think they're overall just worse than the alternatives. However, just because they're worse than the alternatives doesn't mean they're bad. Kinich is a fine carry overall, which means that even his suboptimal teams are going to be at least good enough to clear. I'd say that as a general rule, Bennett Emilie is going to be Pog, Bennett Furina is going to be Pog, Bennett Flex is going to be Pog, Burgeon is going to be Dog, okay. Emilie Flex is going to be okay. Hyperbloom Flex is going to be Pog, and Burning Load is going to be good. With Pog, good, okay. That pretty much does it for this. I want to conclude by quickly covering what I think his overall power level is going to be. He is, I think, a pretty ordinary character. He is not insane, and he's not horrible. I think when everything goes right in single target, he's definitely a pretty strong carry, but his inability to deal well with AoE scenarios make it so that he's not that great overall. I definitely wouldn't pick him over a character like Navia, even though when it comes to just single target output, he's definitely competitive, if not just better than her. He doesn't have the same front load ability, nor does he necessarily perform as well in AoE. Personally, I think he looks really fun to play. I think having interactive things to do during your rotations, like the circle minigame, is going to be just fun to do. So I'm looking forward to him quite a bit. But in terms of power, I think he's the sort of character that if you like him and you can put him in and his good teams, he is going to be strong. But if you don't like him, you're not going to regret skipping him, which is generally what I consider to be optimal balance. I don't want the character to feel like you have to get them, but I don't want to feel like about playing a character either. So I'm pretty happy with his balance. Looking forward to see how he actually turns out. Obviously, as usual, stay tuned for the first impressions and post-release analysis if you want actual confirmation of my thoughts, because everything is done with a bunch of assumptions when it comes to pre-release analysis, and before testing myself, it can be pretty rough. So keep that in mind, make sure you subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.